And these forests typically have a growing season of 5 to 6 months and a distinct annual rhythm of leaf drop in the fall, and the production of new leaves in the spring. So this is where we are going to see true autumn, where things are dropping their leaves and then growing them again in the spring. So let's move on to coniferous forest. Coniferous means cone bearing, a little larger range in our temperature, so more seasonal variation, and some precipitation here as well. Notice we find our coniferous forests mainly up here throughout Canada and Northern Asia and Europe. And our coniferous forests, or cone-bearing forests, have evergreen trees where they don't drop their leaves in the fall. They're going to stay green and keep their leaves, or quite often in this case, the pine needles, throughout the year. This is spruce, pine, fir, hemlock that dominate coniferous forests. The northern coniferous forest is known as the taiga. It's the largest terrestrial biome on Earth. It's found up in Canada, and it's characterized by long, cold winters and short, wet summers. And the temperate rainforests of coastal North America are also coniferous forests. So moving even more north, we're up into the tundra. So if you take a look, we've got a little more temperature range here, a little precipitation. And the tundra covers expansive areas of the Arctic. Remember, the Arctic's at the north, Antarctic's at the south, so we're looking at the north here, between the taiga and the permanently frozen polar ice, and it's treeless. So the treeless Arctic tundra is characterized by permafrost, which is continuously frozen subsoil. So the part of the earth that's underneath that first layer of soil is frozen all the time and may receive as little precipitation as some deserts. So very, very little precipitation. Part of the problem that we're finding with climate change is that permafrost is melting. So these areas of the soil that typically are frozen all the time and have been frozen all the time for, possibly thousands of years, are now starting to melt. So imagine if that part of the soil is starting to melt. That has a huge impact. A lot of the plants won't be able to survive because a lot of the plants that live here are adapted to living on top of the permafrost. It's going to become squishy. Things are going to collapse. That's especially important for human populations that live on the permafrost. Because imagine if it melts, that whole area is going to go into the soil. Not great. And then we move even more north and we get into polar ice. So we're looking very, very north up here at the poles and also down here in Antarctica. So we're going to be getting different temperature range, very little precipitation. So polar ice covers the land north of the tundra, much of the Arctic Ocean, and also the continent of Antarctica down at the south. Temperatures are extremely cold year round, so we're not getting a lot of seasonal variation in temperature. It's just cold all the time, and precipitation is very low. The terrestrial polar biome is closely intertwined with the neighboring marine biome. And when we refer to marine creatures, the word marine actually means they get the majority of their food from the water. And so polar bears are actually marine mammals because polar bears, they don't live in the water, but they're getting most of their food from the water. And so a lot of the organisms that live here, because take a look, right, there's lots of ice, there's not much food on the ice. So most of the critters that live on polar ice are getting their food from the water. And so it's very important that they be able to move from ice cap to ice cap in order to fish and to hunt. And so that's one of the problems with climate change, is that it's melting the polar ice, and the organisms like polar bears are not having anywhere to go. Like, they can only swim for so long. And so polar bears are trying to swim to the next ice cap to get more food. And if that next ice cap is melted, sometimes they drown. So polar ice is actually incredibly important, but it is one of the biomes that is being most affected by climate change. All right, so you should now be able to define and distinguish between different levels within the ecosystem. What makes a population different than a community? Distinguish between biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. Describe the abiotic factors that influence life in the biosphere. Describe the adaptations that enable, oh, I didn't talk specifically about pronghorns. I mentioned that they're there. Fastest land mammals in North America. That's fine. You don't need to be able to describe all their adaptations. Describe the abiotic and biotic characters of different ocean zones, adjacent aquatic zones, and the freshwater biomes. Describe the different types of freshwater biomes, and describe the characteristics used to define terrestrial biomes. And Don't leave yet, because we're going to get just into population ecology a little bit. But out of this chapter, what we just covered in this lecture, the most important thing I want you to be able to do is list the different biomes, list their characteristics. All right, so study that. Now stay put, take a breath, pause if you need to, and we're going to go briefly into population ecology. I'm not going to cover as much of this because I think what we just covered is more important for you to know. So I'm just going to cover a few key pieces of chapter 36 that I think are important for you to understand about population ecology, but we're not going to go through the entire chapter. So don't worry too much about it. Just listen to what I have to say about chapter 36 here. So has parental care evolved by natural selection? Consider parental investment, the time and energy expended on offspring. So I'm going to give you, you can read that, but I'm gonna give you the synopsis of this. So what the book is asking here is, how much energy do you put into raising offspring? And there's really two, I want to say trains of thought, but it's not a conscious choice that these organisms are making. It's evolved through natural selection. There's two main ways. Either you have a bunch of offspring and you don't really care for them, right? Not that you like, I don't care about you, but like you don't actually physically care for them. We see this a lot in fish where they're going to have, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of babies. And they're not going to put any effort into raising them. And they're going to have that many because they know most of them aren't going to survive. So if I have 500 offspring, maybe 5 of them survive, right? But I'm not investing a lot of energy in them. Each one is tiny. I'm not going to raise it. I'm just going to make all these tiny little things. Some of them will survive, and that's fine. The other way to do that, what you see a lot in mammals, including humans, is you'll have just a few offspring, right? You might have 1 baby, 2 babies, maybe 3 babies, but you're going to expend a lot of energy. They're going to be more fully developed, so more energy creating those offspring, and then you'll also typically raise them. And so you're only having, 1, 2, 3, 4 offspring, but most of them are going to survive. So those are kind of the two main ways. You have a whole bunch of offspring that you don't really care for, knowing that most of them aren't going to survive, or you have a few offspring that you invest a lot of energy into, and therefore most of those will survive. So you end up with about the same survival rate, just different tactics of how you get there. So the big ideas we're going to look at are population structure and dynamics, and then we're going to very, very briefly touch on the human population. Mainly, it's big. There's a lot of us. That's going to be the key point I'm going to be making, is there's a whole bunch of humans and we're causing a whole bunch of destruction. So let's take a brief look at population structure and dynamics. So population ecology is the study of how and why populations change. And again, a population is a group of individuals of a single species that occupies the same general area. Individuals in a population typically rely on the same resources, they're influenced by the same environmental factors, and are likely to interact and breed with one another. Population ecology is concerned with changes in population size and factors that regulate populations over time. And populations can either increase through birth and immigration. So immigration with an I means organisms moving into that area. Populations can decrease through death and emigration with an E, and emigration with an E means organisms are moving out of an area. Population density is the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume. So you quite often hear the human population referred to as number of people per square mile. And within a population's geographic range, local densities may vary greatly. So think about if you're in the heart of New York City, there's going to be a whole bunch of humans per square mile. If you go out to the country, there's not going to be very many humans per square mile. That is what we're talking about for population density. And then there's this idea of carrying capacity, which is the number of people or other living organisms or crops that a region can support without environmental degradation. So it's basically the highest number of organisms of that species in that population that the environment can support without the environment starting to break down. The dispersion pattern of a population refers to the way individuals are spaced within their area. I'm going to show you a picture of this in just a minute, but there's a clumped dispersion pattern, there's a uniform dispersion pattern, and there's a random dispersion pattern, and they're pretty much exactly what they sound like. Clumped dispersion means you're going to find resources that are often unequally distributed, and individuals are grouped around these patches. So imagine that the food is here, here, and here. You're going to find those individuals grouped here, here, and here. In a uniform dispersion pattern, they're uniformly distributed. So individuals are most likely interacting and equally spaced. So you're going to find them, kind of all over. And then random means they're just all over the place and there's no pattern to it. Very unpredictable. So if you take a look at these sea stars, what type do you think this is? Yep, so this is clumped. You're going to find them in clumps around certain resources that they need. So this is clumped distribution. If you look at this one is humans at the beach, especially right now with social distancing, right? Nobody wants to be near each other. So this is uniform, where they're spread out fairly equally throughout the area. And if you take a look here, you'll notice not as equally spread out as the last one we looked at. So this one is random. If you just find them all over the place, there's no pattern, that is random distribution. So know those three, be able to identify them with words. If I were to describe them in words or to show you a picture, be able to tell me what type of distribution that is. There are multiple factors that may limit population growth. So as a population's density increases, the more individuals you find per a certain area. Factors such as limited food supply and increased disease or predation may increase the death rate, decrease the birth rate, or both. There's also abiotic density independent factors, such as severe weather that may limit natural populations. And most populations are probably regulated by a mixture of both. So some populations have what we refer to as a boom and bust cycle. So populations of insects, birds, and mammals undergo dramatic fluctuations in density with fairly regular intervals. So booms are characterized by rapid exponential growth. And so we get a whole bunch of babies. And then busts is where the population falls back to a minimum level. So we get a whole bunch of babies, but then a whole bunch of things die. So big boom, whole bunch of new animals, but then a bunch of them die. So lots of populations have those boom and bust cycles. And evolution shapes life histories. And natural selection shapes a species' life history. And a life history is a series of events from birth through reproduction to death. So if we're looking kind of at the life cycle, we call that the life history. And there's two types of life history that we're going to be looking at. Make sure you know the difference here. So there's populations with what's called an R-selected life history and populations with a K-selected life history. Populations with an R-selected life history have traits, they produce many offspring and grow rapidly in unpredictable environments. Populations with K-selected traits raise few offspring and maintain relatively stable populations. So think back to what I said at the very beginning here. So populations with R-selected life histories produce a whole bunch of offspring, but they don't invest a ton of energy into them, knowing that a lot of them aren't going to survive. Populations with K-selected traits raise just a few offspring, but they put a lot of energy into them, so they know that they're going to survive. And so R-selected life history patterns are much more unpredictable because you could be having 500 offspring and maybe it's a great year with great conditions and 400 of them survive. Or it could be a year that's not great for them and 2 of them survive, right? Very, very unpredictable. So we see a lot more fluctuation in the R-selected life history traits, whereas our K-selected populations are going to be having a few offspring, but they're going to invest a lot of energy in them. So regardless of, the environmental conditions, those offspring quite often survive. They survive a lot more than the R-selected ones, they're at least more stable than our R-selected populations. But those are kind of the two extremes. Like if you're true R-selected or true K-selected, a lot of species actually fall in between them. It's more of a continuum. So principles of population ecology have practical applications for us, including sustainable resource management. So sustainable resource management involves practices that allow the use of natural resources without damaging it. Think of sustainable fisheries, right? Because we have had this idea for a long time that the ocean is just an endless resource and that fish just keep magically appearing until we overfish them and fisheries collapsed. And so that is not only bad for the fish, that is also bad for us because a lot of the human population eats fish. And so sustainable resource management is looking at how we can use resources in a sustainable way. So we are able to extract the resources that we need while leaving enough that those resources are going to be able to replenish themselves and support the populations of plants and animals and algae and everything else that lives in that area. And according to the logistic growth model, the fastest growth rate occurs when the population size is at roughly half the carrying capacity of the habitat. So just know that part, that the fastest growth rate occurs when the population size is at roughly half the carrying capacity of the habitat. So we just need to keep that in mind when we're talking about sustainable resource management. Because in terms of population growth, it means maintaining high population growth to replenish the population. And so if we're taking resources, we want those resources to be able to replenish themselves very quickly, whether that be fish or different trees that we're cutting down. We want them to be able to replenish themselves very quickly because we want to be able to then go back in and extract more resources, while at the same time leaving enough for the other critters that are there. And it's at about half the carrying capacity that they're able to replenish themselves most quickly. So we need to figure out what the carrying capacity is, and make sure that we don't take more than half. All right, so we're going to touch briefly on the human population. Again, to sum up everything I'm about to just say, there's a whole bunch of us and we are wreaking havoc. So the human population continues to increase, even though the growth rate is slowing. So we have realized there's a whole bunch of humans. We've gotten better contraception, more education. And so the human growth rate is slowing compared to what it used to, but there's still a whole bunch of us, which means even though the growth rate is slowing, it's still increasing. So we're going to be talking about a couple different factors here: the age structure of a population, which is the breakdown of that population into age groups. So if you've ever taken a survey, you've probably been asked, are you, 0 to 18, 18 to 35, 35 to 45, something like that. That is the age structure. So how many old people do we have? How many young people do we have? And then there's this idea of population momentum, which is the continued growth that occurs despite reduction of the fertility rate to replacement level. And as a result of girls in the 0 to 14 age group of a previously expanding population reaching their childbearing years. So basically, population momentum means we see a little bit of a lag if we put measures into place to reduce population growth, because there's already some women who were born who are going to take up to 14 years to reach reproductive age. There's a little bit of a lag between efforts to slow population growth and actually slowing it, because we would have already had women born. So if you take a look, here's data from 1990, data from 2015, and a projection into 2040. You can actually see the shifting age range. So population in millions is on the x-axis, age in years is on the y-axis. And so you can actually see that back in 1990, the population was much younger, right? When we move into 2015, you'll see it's starting to expand. And so we're getting more folks in the upper ranges of age. And then projected by 2040, we're actually going to see not as much variation in the age structure. So lots of young people over here in 1990. You'll notice that there's a little more even distribution amongst the age ranges here in our projection for 2040. And we've got some coloration here. So this shows that lag that I was talking about, because even though we have taken measures to slow down the population growth, we have this group of women here who are going to mature and be of childbearing age over here. And so you're going to start noticing that here, but showing you the lag there. So age structures reveal social and economic trends. Age structure diagrams, like what we just looked at, reveal a population's growth trends and social conditions. An expanding population has an increasing need for schools, employment, and infrastructure. More people, more need for things for people. And a large elderly population requires extensive resources to be allocated to healthcare. And then an ecological footprint. An ecological footprint is a measure of resource consumption. So you might have heard of this. What is your ecological footprint? What is your carbon footprint? How many resources are you using? And the question that we're trying to answer is, how large of a population of humans can Earth actually hold? An ecological footprint estimates the amount of land required by each person or country to produce all the resources it consumes and to absorb all of its waste. So when you think about how much land you need, don't just think of how much land you need to live on, right? You might be thinking like, oh, like I live in a 250 square foot apartment with 4 other people. I don't need that much space. Well, think about all the stuff that you're using. Think about all the food that you eat, all the water that you drink, all of the physical items that you own. Think of how much you drive, think of how much energy you use, and think of how much more land it takes to support all of that. That's what we're talking about for ecological footprint. And there are online calculators for this where you can put in, how much energy you use, how big your house is, how often you drive, how many kids you have, if you eat meat or not, things like that. And it will actually tell you what your ecological footprint is. Very interesting, very shocking for most Americans. And comparing our demand for resources with biocapacity, the Earth's capacity to renew these resources, gives us a broad view of the sustainability of human activity. And I'm going to tell you right now, American human activity, not very sustainable, which is why I guess I'm employed. Big need for conservation. But that's also why, when you're thinking about conservation, you think that these small things don't help. Like, what does it really matter if I turn off the lights when I leave a room, or if I get a reusable water bottle, or I use reusable bags? Like, those are just really, really small things. Like, how much of a difference does it make? And it might not seem like it makes much of a difference if just you do it, but imagine if every single one of your friends also got a reusable water bottle, right? Think about the impact of that. Think if every human did that, what an impact that would have. So these little things do add up and help us to reduce our ecological footprint. And that is our goal. Our goal right now is to decrease our ecological footprint because they're real big. So look at this clever little table here. It's actually showing you ecological footprint of some different countries. If you look at per person, Australia has a pretty big ecological footprint. The United States is up here. I want you to take a look at this. The world average is 2.8. The fair share, it says, is 1.7. But look at this, world average is 2.8. Humans are up here at Americans are up here at 8.2. So we are using quite a few resources compared to our population. Sustainability is our goal, right? Sustainability is the goal of developing, managing, and conserving Earth's resources in a way that meet the needs of people without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. So it's basically leaving enough that future generations are still going to have some. And the global ecological footprint already exceeds sustainable levels. We passed that. So now we're trying to backtrack. There's disparity between resource consumption in more developed and less developed nations. So less developed nations quite often have more of the resources, but it's the developed nations like the United States that are using most of those resources. And we use a whole lot more than a lot of other countries. All right. So that was our quick view through population ecology. So you should now be able to define a population ecology. You should be able to define population density and describe the different types of dispersion patterns. We talked about the idea of carrying capacity. We talked about R-selected versus K-selected populations. We defined a boom and bust cycle. We looked a little bit at the human population and the structure and how it is changing. And we talked about the concept of an ecological footprint, especially the uneven reliance upon natural resources throughout the world. So that is the end of this lecture, and I will see you in the next.